The first barrel of blasting powder detonated like the wrath of heaven itself, sending a pillar of orange flame clawing toward the star-scattered sky above Willow Springs. The explosion's thunderclap rolled across the prairie like divine judgment, rattling windows 3 blocks away and sending horses rearing in terror at hitching posts throughout the settlement. Tokala had been walking back from the Cottonwood Grove, where he'd completed his monthly ceremony to honor his grandfather's spirit and the memory of his little sister, Ayanna, who had died in his arms 7 winters ago when raiders attacked their winter camp. He touched the beaded headband at his brow, its 2 sacred eagle feathers catching moonlight as they shifted with his movement. Each feather had been earned through acts of protection and courage, blessed by the elders and worn only during the most sacred moments of communion with the spirits. The worn leather band beneath them bore traditional blue and white beadwork his grandmother had created, each pattern carrying prayers for guidance and strength. The memory of Ayanna's final breath always returned during these ceremonies, how he'd failed to protect her from the bullets that found their way through the lodge walls, how her small hand had grown cold in his, while smoke from burning teepees filled the winter air. She had been 6 years old, the same age as the child whose screams now cut through the night like a blade through his heart. The second explosion knocked him sideways, the ground bucking beneath his moccasined feet like an enraged Mustang trying to throw its rider. Barrels of black powder carelessly stored in the freight yard for transport to silver mines 20 miles east were cooking off in a deadly chain reaction that lit up the darkness like glimpses into hell itself. Each detonation sent sparks spiraling through the air, like malevolent fireflies illuminating chaos below where settlers scattered between buildings like startled cattle fleeing a prairie storm. That's when he heard it cutting through the roar of flames and panicked, shouting a child's scream, high-pitched and terrified, coming from somewhere near the burning freight shed, where wooden crates were splintering like kindling in a bonfire. The sound pierced his heart with painful clarity, awakening every protective instinct he possessed, while memories of Ayanna's last moments flooded back with crushing force. Not again. Never again would he let a child die while he still drew breath. Tokala broke into a run, his long braids streaming behind him as he sprinted down the rocky slope toward the inferno below. The weight of his cultural isolation pressed against him. With each step he was tolerated in Willow Springs because of his skills as a scout and translator, but never truly accepted. White settlers saw him as useful but foreign, and while some of his own people questioned his choice to live among those who had taken their lands. Tonight, none of that mattered. A child needed help, and help she would have regardless of the color of her skin or the suspicions her rescue might bring. The freight yard had become a vision of biblical apocalypse. Tongues of flame licked hungrily at overturned wagons, while scattered barrels rolled across packed earth like lost souls seeking escape from damnation. The air itself seemed to burn shimmering with heat that made distant objects dance like mirages in desert country. Near the collapsed corner of the main storage shed, beneath a heavy oak plank that had fallen from a supply wagon, when the first explosion lifted it 10 feet into the air, he saw her. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, with pale hair matted against her dirt-streaked face like spun gold tarnished by catastrophe. Her small hands pushed uselessly against the timber, pinning her legs to the ground, and her blue eyes were wide with the kind of terror that marked a child's first encounter with her own mortality. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, where debris had struck her, and her dress, once white with tiny blue flowers, was torn and stained with soot and crimson that spoke of injuries beyond what he could immediately see. "Easy, little one," Tokala said in English, his voice steady despite the chaos around them as he dropped to his knees beside the massive plank. The wood was solid oak, thick as a man's torso, and heavy enough to crush bone if it shifted wrong. Splinters jutted from its surface where the explosion had torn it from its moorings, each one sharp enough to open flesh to the bone. He braced his feet against the wagon wheel, feeling the heat of nearby flames on his back, like the breath of some enormous beast, and heaved with every ounce of strength his lean frame possessed. Muscles strained against the weight as he lifted the beam just enough for the child to pull her legs free. Agony shooting through his injured knee like lightning, the old wound from last winter's buffalo hunt where his horse had fallen and rolled over him, leaving him with a limp that worsened in cold weather. The old injury screamed protest, but he held the weight steady, refusing to let pain compromise the child's safety. She scrambled backward with the desperation of a trapped animal, finally seeing escape favoring her right ankle, where the timber had pressed against it, but moving under her own power. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps, but she was alive and mobile. That was what mattered most in this moment of crisis and flame. Without hesitation, Tokala unwrapped the thick bison hide cloak from his shoulders, and the same one his grandmother had sewn with sinew and decorated with blue beads the color of winter sky, each bead chosen for its spiritual significance and placed with prayers for protection. The hide was soft from years of use, but strong enough to turn a knife blade tanned with traditional methods that made it supple as silk but tough as armor. He enveloped the child in its protective folds, feeling her small body trembling against his chest like a frightened bird. As he lifted her with careful urgency, one arm supporting her back while the other cradled her legs. "Hold tight to me," he murmured in the gentle tone he'd once used with Ayana, turning toward the yard's edge where flames hadn't yet reached, but were advancing with each passing second, like an army of destruction consuming everything in its path. The third explosion erupted without warning, a blast so powerful it seemed to split the very air itself. The shock wave struck them like a giant's fist, wrapped in fire and fury, and Tokala instinctively twisted his body, shielding the girl with his back, just as red-hot fragments of metal shrieked through the air, where she would have been moving fast enough to punch through human flesh like paper. White-hot fire lanced across his ribs as jagged shrapnel tore through his buckskin shirt and into the muscle beneath each piece, carrying enough heat to cauterize the wounds it made, while sending waves of agony through his nervous system. A larger fragment twisted metal from a barrel's iron hooping struck his right shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer wielded by an angry god, spinning him halfway around and nearly buckling his knees as pain exploded through his entire upper body like molten metal poured into his veins. Blood ran warm and wet down his back, soaking through his shirt in spreading patches that would soon attract flies if he lived long enough for such concerns. But his arms never loosened around the child he carried. Each step sent fresh waves of agony through torn muscles that screamed protests with every movement. But he kept walking forward through sheer force of will, driven by something deeper than courage. A fundamental refusal to let innocence suffer while he still had strength to prevent it. 20 more steps carried them beyond the freight yard's deadly reach, past the invisible line, where flying debris could no longer find them with lethal force. Only then did his legs give out like cut strings, his body's reserves finally exhausted by pain and blood loss. Tokala collapsed to the hard-packed dirt of Main Street, still clutching the girl against his chest, with protective instincts that overrode his body's desperate need to surrender to unconsciousness. She looked up at him with those wide blue eyes that reflected the firelight like captured stars, no longer crying, but studying his face with the serious attention children gave to things beyond their understanding. Her small hand reached up to touch the wetness on his cheek, blood mixed with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding, while her other hand clutched at the sacred feathers in his headband as if they were lifelines to safety. Behind them, the freight shed continued burning with a fury that seemed to mock human attempts at control, casting dancing shadows across Willow Springs' weathered buildings like some apocalyptic vision torn from biblical prophecy. The flames reached toward heaven with hungry fingers, consuming everything they touched. while somewhere in their heart, more barrels waited to add their voices to this symphony of destruction that would be remembered for generations. Townspeople found them there minutes later, a Lakota man with a blood-stained beaded headband holding a dirt-faced little girl wrapped in buffalo hide, while orange flames painted the night sky behind them like a scene from the end of the world. Some rushed forward to help with the instinctive compassion that frontier life bred in decent people who understood that survival often depended on mutual aid. Others hung back, hands resting on gun butts, watching with the wariness that those same harsh conditions taught as a survival skill, where the difference between friend and enemy might not be clear until bullets started flying. Dr. Edwin arrived first, his black medical bag clutched in one hand and a kerosene lantern in the other, and the yellow light dancing across his weathered features as he assessed the scene before him. The physician was a thin man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles that had seen better days and the confident manner of someone who'd practiced medicine on the frontiers long enough to survive its particular challenges and develop an instinct for triage that could mean the difference between life and death in crisis situations. Great Scott, what happened here? Edwin knelt beside them without hesitation, his professional instincts overriding any personal concerns as he began assessing the blood seeping through Tokala's shirt in patterns that told stories of violence and sacrifice to eyes trained in reading such signs. Explosion trapped the child beneath fallen timber. Tokala managed his voice rough with smoke and pain, but still steady with the discipline of a warrior who'd learned not to let suffering compromise his ability to communicate vital information. She was pinned when I found her couldn't free herself. "Can you stand?" Edwin asked, noting the way Tokala favored his right side and the pallor that spoke of significant blood loss requiring immediate attention. Tokala tried to rise, but immediately sat back down as fire lanced through his shoulder like a red-hot poker thrust between his ribs, the movement sending fresh streams of blood down his back. The girl, someone in the crowd called her Nellie, remained pressed against his side, her small fingers clutching the fringe of his cloak, like it was her only anchor in a world that had suddenly gone mad with explosions and flames and the acrid smell of burning wood that filled her nostrils with each frightened breath. "Bring them to my clinic immediately," Edwin ordered with medical authority that brooked no argument. But his words were interrupted by the sound of approaching boots and the distinctive jingle of spurs that announced official presence moving through the crowd with purposeful strides. Sheriff Conrad appeared through the gathering like a storm front moving across clear sky, Deputy Quiet Will beside him, both men with hands resting on the grips of their Colt revolvers in the casual way that suggested long familiarity with violence, and the kind of situational awareness that kept lawmen alive on the frontier. Conrad was a big man in his 40s, with graying hair that had once been black as coal, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of a scene, including the fresh blood on Tokala's back, the sacred feathers in his beaded headband that marked him as distinctly Lakota, and most especially the child he protected with such obvious, fierce devotion. Something flickered in Conrad's expression when his gaze fell on the little girl, a brief tightening around his eyes, accompanied by an almost involuntary movement of his hand toward his shirt pocket, as if reaching for something precious and painful. Then stopping abruptly, as though he'd caught himself in some forbidden act that might reveal secrets better left buried. "Step away from the girl," Conrad commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of badge authority, but also something deeper, a tension that seemed almost personal, as if this moment carried significance beyond simple law enforcement duties that he couldn't quite bring himself to explain. Behind the sheriff, other men gathered like storm clouds, building toward violence, ranch hands from local spreads with dust on their clothes and suspicion in their eyes that spoke of hard lives and harder prejudices. Jake Morrison, the freight supervisor, with soot streaking his weathered face and fury radiating from his posture as he surveyed the destruction of his livelihood. Even a few saloon drifters who'd been drinking when the explosion started and now saw an opportunity for excitement that might relieve the tedium of frontier existence. All carried weapons of various descriptions: rifles, pistols, knives, and makeshift clubs. And all watched Tokala with the kind of attention that meant trouble was brewing as surely as thunder follows lightning across the prairie. The child whimpered and pressed closer to Tokala's side, her instinctive fear of the armed men as clear as spoken words in a language everyone understood. Conrad's jaw tightened as he stared at her with growing intensity, his hand unconsciously moving toward his shirt pocket again in that same reaching gesture, then stopping with visible effort as if fighting some internal battle that was tearing him apart from within. "Sheriff." A woman's voice cut through the tension like a schoolmarm, calling unruly children to order, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of managing difficult situations and refusing to be intimidated by displays of masculine aggression. That's quite enough of this nonsense. Beatrice Thompson pushed past the ranch hands with quiet determination that brooked no argument from men twice her size, her presence changing the dynamics of the confrontation simply by introducing a voice of reason and civilization into what had been rapidly degenerating into mob mentality. She was younger than Tokala had expected from her authoritative tone, perhaps 25, but carried herself with the kind of confidence that suggested intelligence education and the sort of strong character that had brought her west in search of something the civilized East couldn't provide. Beatrice had come to Willow Springs 6 months ago from Boston, fleeing the suffocating expectations of a society marriage her father had arranged to a man twice her age who viewed women as ornaments rather than equals decoration for his social ambitions, rather than partners worthy of respect and consideration. She discovered through careful eavesdropping that her intended husband had gambling debts that made her substantial dowry more attractive than her person, and she'd chosen the uncertainty of frontier life over the certainty of becoming a beautiful caged bird in a gilded drawing room. The frontier might be harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving, but it offered something the civilized East never could. With the freedom to make her own choices, live by her own merits, and build a life based on what she contributed rather than what she inherited. Her brown wool dress was practical rather than fashionable, designed for function over appearance in a place where vanity could be a fatal luxury, and her dark hair was pinned back efficiently in the manner of a working woman who had little time or patience for elaborate styling, but there was steel beneath her gentle manner strength that matched Tokala's own in different ways, and intelligence that blazed in her eyes like a beacon for anyone wise enough to recognize its value. "Miss Thompson," Conrad acknowledged with a tip of his hat that spoke of ingrained courtesy from a childhood when manners mattered, but his weapon remained drawn and ready for use, despite his polite words. "This situation doesn't concern the schoolhouse or your students. It concerns me deeply when you're pointing weapons at a man who risked his life for one of my students." Beatrice replied with crisp authority that would have made any politician proud and any bully think twice about continuing their aggression. She moved to Nellie's side with gentle efficiency that immediately calmed the frightened child, her presence radiating the kind of protective competence that children instinctively recognized and trusted. "Nellie hasn't spoken since the fire began, but she won't let go of this man's cloak. Children have excellent instincts about who they can trust, Sheriff, and her judgment in this case is quite clear." Conrad's face went pale as desert sand at the mention of the child's name, and his hand trembled slightly on his weapon's grip as if the simple word had struck him like a physical blow. "Nellie, what's her full name, Miss Thompson?" "Patterson," Beatrice said, watching his reaction with growing concern as his complexion went from pale to ashen, like a man who'd seen his own ghost walking toward him in broad daylight. "Nellie Patterson. Her family has the homestead near Willow Creek, about 5 miles east of town." The color drained completely from Conrad's face, as if someone had opened his veins and let his life's blood flow out onto the dusty ground, and his hand jerked toward his pocket in that same unconscious gesture that spoke of some precious and terrible secret hidden close to his heart. He stared at the child for a long moment, with something like recognition and horror warring in his expression, like two armies fighting for control of the same battlefield, while memories he'd tried to bury clawed their way back to the surface of his consciousness. Hidden in his shirt pocket, his fingers found the silver locket he kept there, the one containing a photograph of Sarah Patterson and a lock of blonde hair from her daughter. The locket Hugh had given him years ago, before their father's death, had driven a wedge between the brothers that had never fully healed. The metal was warm from being carried close to his heart, but it felt cold as ice against his fingertips as the terrible implications of this night's events began to sink in with crushing weight. Patterson, he repeated in a voice barely above a whisper, with the name seeming to carry weight far beyond its simple syllables, echoing in his mind like an accusation that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. 3 hours later, in the quiet sanctuary of Dr. Edwin's clinic, Tokolata woke to the medicinal smell of carbolic acid mixed with the softer scents of laudanum and clean bandages, his shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat in a rhythm that reminded him he was still alive, despite everything that had happened. When he attempted movement, fresh fire shot down his right arm, like molten metal poured into his veins, forcing him to remain still, while consciousness slowly returned, like dawn creeping across the prairie after a long night of storm and violence. He was lying on a narrow cot in what appeared to be the physician's private treatment room, white sheets pulled to his chest and his sacred headband hanging carefully on a wooden peg nearby, treated with the respect that few white settlers showed to Native American religious objects, suggesting Edwin understood their significance better than most frontier doctors, who viewed such things as primitive superstition rather than expressions of profound spiritual belief. Nellie was curled on a smaller bed beside his, still wrapped in his bison hide cloak, like a small animal seeking warmth and protection from a hostile world. She was awake, watching him with those serious blue eyes that seemed far too old for her young face, her small fingers absently stroking the soft fringe of the hide, as if the repetitive motion brought comfort to her traumatized mind and helped her process experiences no child should ever have to endure. Sheriff Conrad stood by the window with his back turned to them, his shoulders tense with some internal struggle that seemed to be tearing him apart piece by piece. He kept reaching into his shirt pocket with movements that suggested long habit, then stopping as if the gesture caused physical pain, as though touching whatever he kept there was both necessary and unbearable at the same time. The morning light streaming through the glass cast his silhouette in sharp relief, making him look older than his years and bearing the weight of sins that had aged him beyond his natural span. "About time you woke up," Conrad said without turning around, his voice carrying undertones of strain that hadn't been there the night before, as if the intervening hours had brought revelations that had fundamentally changed his understanding of the situation. "We need to discuss last night's events and their implications for everyone involved." Dr. Edwin stepped between them like a referee entering a boxing ring, wiping his hands on a blood-stained towel with the methodical movements of a man who'd spent decades dealing with frontier violence and had developed the kind of professional detachment that allowed him to function effectively in crisis situations. The physician had removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms marked with old scars. Evidence of a practitioner who'd learned his trade in circumstances where mistakes carried permanent consequences and where the difference between life and death often came down to skill, experience, and steady hands under pressure. Conrad, this man, saved that child's life at considerable risk to his own, Edwin stated with the firm authority of medical expertise that wouldn't be contradicted by anyone who'd seen the evidence. I pulled 3 pieces of shrapnel from his back, and the entry angles proved beyond any reasonable doubt that he was shielding her from the blast with his own body. If he'd been responsible for setting that fire, he wouldn't have run toward it to rescue anyone, much less risked his life for a child he'd never met before. "Maybe so," Conrad replied, but his voice carried a strain that suggested deeper concerns than simple law enforcement, as if he were wrestling with implications that went far beyond questions of guilt or innocence in the freight yard explosion. But that still doesn't explain what he was doing near the freight yard at that particular time of night, when most decent folks were home in their beds. From the doorway, Beatrice's voice carried sharp authority that could have cut glass and made it clear she wouldn't tolerate any more unfounded accusations against a man who'd proven his character through heroic action. He was performing a monthly ceremony in the Cottonwood Grove, as any number of people in this town could attest if you bothered to ask them instead of assuming guilt based on prejudice and ignorance. She entered the room with purposeful strides that spoke of determination and moral clarity, moving to Nellie's bedside with the kind of gentle efficiency that demonstrated experience with frightened children and an intuitive understanding of how to provide comfort in traumatic circumstances. The little girl's face lit up at Beatrice's approach, suggesting a bond had already formed between them during the night's events that went beyond simple adult supervision into genuine caring and mutual affection. As she sat beside the child and began checking her for signs of lasting injury, Tokala found himself studying Beatrice's face and movements with growing appreciation for her competence and strength. There was intelligence in her dark eyes that spoke of education and curiosity, but also practical wisdom that came from facing harsh realities and making difficult decisions. Her hands were gentle but sure as she examined Nellie's injuries, and her voice carried a warmth that seemed to ease the child's fears while maintaining the firmness necessary to establish boundaries and expectations. "Nellie, sweetheart, can you tell us your full name?" Beatrice asked in the patient tone she used with nervous students who needed encouragement to overcome their shyness. The girl looked from Beatrice to Tokala, her eyes seeking reassurance from the man who'd saved her life before she felt safe enough to speak. When she saw his encouraging nod, she whispered in a voice still rough from smoke inhalation, "Nellie Patterson." Conrad's hand jerked toward his pocket again with that same involuntary movement that was becoming as regular as breathing. And this time, he pulled out a small object, a tarnished silver locket that caught the morning light streaming through the window. He stared at it for a long moment, with such profound anguish that it was painful to witness his weathered features crumpling like paper in a fire, as memories and guilt crashed over him in waves he could no longer control or suppress. The locket was old, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. And when Conrad opened it with trembling fingers, it revealed a photograph of a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a lock of blonde hair that exactly matched Nellie's. But more than that, it contained the weight of a relationship that had defined much of his adult life, his connection to Hugh Patterson, the brother he'd lost through pride and stubbornness, and to Sarah Patterson, the sister-in-law, who'd been like family until circumstances and distance had driven them apart. Patterson. He repeated like a prayer or curse, the name echoing in the small room with the weight of recognition and regret. Hugh Patterson's daughter. "You knew her father personally?" Beatrice asked, noting his obvious emotional distress and the way his hands shook as he held the locket as though it contained his own heart. Conrad started, then stopped as if the words were physically stuck in his throat, blocked by years of accumulated guilt and shame that made honest confession almost impossible. He slipped the locket back into his pocket with movements that spoke of long practice, but also of deep reluctance to let go of this connection to a family he'd failed in ways that went beyond simple neglect. "I knew of him. Settler family who moved here from back east about 5 years ago, trying to make a new life on the frontier. But Tokala had seen the recognition blazing in Conrad's eyes like a signal fire on a distant hill. The way his hands shook when he held that locket, as if it contained memories too precious and too painful to bear examination in the light of day. There was far more to this story than simple knowledge of a local homesteader, something deeply personal that the sheriff was desperately trying to hide behind his badge and official authority, while his conscience ate away at him from within like acid. "There's something else you need to see," Beatrice said quietly, pulling a folded paper from her dress pocket with the careful movements of someone handling precious cargo that could change everything if properly understood. "I found this sewn into Nellie's dress hem while I was cleaning her up last night and checking for injuries. It's a legal document of considerable importance." She unfolded the paper with reverent care, revealing official seals and formal language that spoke of governmental authority and legal binding that couldn't be easily dismissed or ignored. It's a land deed properly executed and witnessed. 80 acres along Tallow Creek, legally deeded to Hugh Patterson with full inheritance rights, passing to his daughter, Nellie Patterson, upon his death. Conrad's face went white as fresh snow on a mountain peak as he read the names and legal descriptions that laid out property boundaries with surveyor's precision. His eyes lingered on the signature lines with an intensity that suggested he was reading more than just legal text, recognizing names and connections that carried personal significance far beyond their official meaning. For a moment, his carefully composed facade cracked entirely like ice, under sudden pressure, revealing depths of guilt and anguish that he'd been struggling to keep hidden from the world and perhaps from himself. "Where are her parents now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might make the answer more real than he could bear to accept. "Madre dead," Beatrice replied with gentle sorrow that acknowledged the tragedy while being honest about its reality and the implications for the orphaned child who remained. "Both killed in a stagecoach robbery 3 weeks ago near Copper Canyon, about 20 miles south of here. Nellie was the only survivor because her mother managed to hide her under mail sacks when the shooting started. Though the poor child had to listen to everything that happened without being able to help or understand why such terrible things occur in the world." Conrad closed his eyes as if the words had struck him with physical force, and when he opened them again, they were filled with something that looked suspiciously like guilt mixed with grief and self-loathing that went far deeper than simple sympathy for strangers who'd met violent ends. The muscle in his jaw twitched as he fought for control over emotions that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure and reveal secrets that could destroy what remained of his reputation and self-respect. "That deed makes her a valuable target," he said with the hollow tone of a man stating facts he wished weren't true, but couldn't deny or ignore any longer. Tallow Creek water rights are worth killing for in this territory, and someone burned this freight yard to destroy evidence that might interfere with their plans. They'll come for her next to eliminate the witness and clear the way for their own claims. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, in his mansion overlooking the valley like a feudal castle, Tom Dietrich paced his private study like a caged wolf plotting the destruction of everything that stood between him and absolute power. The rancher was a man in his 50s who'd built an empire through ruthless ambition, careful planning, and the systematic elimination of obstacles that threatened his vision of total control over the territory's most valuable resources. His weathered face bore the marks of decades spent under the prairie sun, but his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who understood that true power came not from strength alone, but from the willingness to use that strength without conscience or restraint when circumstances demanded decisive action. The Patterson deed represented more than a simple threat to his expansion plans. It was a fundamental challenge to the empire he'd spent 20 years building through blood bribery and the careful cultivation of fear among those who might otherwise oppose him. Control of Tallow Creek's water rights would allow him to dominate grazing land across 3 territories, effectively making him the most powerful man west of the Missouri River, and positioning his family for generations of wealth and influence that would rival the great dynasties of the East. The girl survived. His son Marcus reported still dusty from the night's reconnaissance mission and bearing news that made his father's jaw clench with barely controlled fury. Conrad has her in protective custody at the doctor's clinic, along with that half-breed scout who pulled her out of the fire. Marcus was 22 years old and bore his father's ruthless ambition without the tempering experience that might have taught him the value of restraint or the dangers of underestimating opponents. He'd grown up believing that the Dietrich name was sufficient to overcome any obstacle that wealth and power made him untouchable, and that violence was simply another tool to be used when negotiation and bribery proved insufficient to achieve desired results. Dietrich's jaw tightened as he considered the implications of this development and the potential complications it represented for plans that had been months in the making. Then, Conrad needs additional motivation to remember where his loyalties lie and what happens to sheriffs who fail to cooperate with the natural order of things in this territory. He moved to his desk and pulled out a leather portfolio containing documents that represented years of careful preparation. Property surveys, legal briefs, correspondence with territorial officials, and most importantly, a detailed accounting of payments made to ensure that certain key individuals understood their roles in the coming transformation of the region's power structure. Sheriff Conrad's name appeared frequently in these records, along with amounts that would have seemed impossibly large to most frontier lawmen, but were merely the cost of doing business for a man of Dietrich's resources and ambitions. The next morning brought disturbing news that confirmed everyone's worst fears about the forces arrayed against them. Someone had broken into the clinic during the darkest hours before dawn, leaving Deputy Quiet Will wounded and bloody evidence that Rusty Joe Carver was involved in whatever conspiracy was unfolding around Nellie Patterson's inheritance. Will was found sitting beside Dr. Edwin's examination table, his left hand pressed against a knife wound on his right forearm that was bleeding freely through his fingers and staining the wooden floor beneath him. The front window had been completely shattered, glass scattered across the room like deadly diamonds that crunched underfoot and reflected the early morning light in patterns that spoke of violence and violation. Among the glittering fragments, Conrad found a leather thong with a carved bead that made Tokala's blood run cold with recognition and memories of past encounters that had ended badly for everyone involved except the red-bearded killer who seemed to thrive on chaos and bloodshed. Rusty Joe. Tokala identified grimly the name, carrying the weight of personal history and future threat that everyone in the room understood without need for elaboration. "You recognize this token?" Conrad asked, but there was something in his voice, not surprise at the identification, but confirmation of something he'd already suspected, as if he'd been expecting this particular calling card and dreading its appearance. Joseph Carver called Rusty Joe for the red beard he wears like a battle flag. Tokala replied with the precision of someone who'd studied his enemies and understood their methods. "He's wanted in 3 territories for robbery, murder, and crimes that most decent people couldn't imagine committing against their worst enemies. I encountered him in Abilene last spring when I was guiding a supply train through dangerous country that was controlled by men like him who preyed on honest travelers. He lost $20 to me in a poker game and took the loss about as gracefully as a rattlesnake takes being stepped on." Conrad pocketed the bead with movements that seemed automatic, his expression troubled in a way that went far beyond simple law enforcement concerns, and suggested personal knowledge of the forces they were dealing with. If Rusty Joe's involved in this business, we're not just dealing with land rights anymore. He doesn't work alone, he doesn't leave witnesses alive to tell tales, and he doesn't take contracts unless the money is substantial enough to make the risks worthwhile. They also discovered that night that Tokala's horse had been deliberately crippled in an act of calculated cruelty designed to eliminate any possibility of escape. Spotted Wolf stood in his stall, with his left foreleg hanging useless, the tendons cut with surgical precision by someone who understood exactly how to disable a horse without killing it immediately. The sight of his faithful companion's injury hit Tokala like a physical blow to his already wounded body, representing not just the loss of transportation, but the destruction of a partnership that had carried him safely through countless miles of dangerous territory. Spotted Wolf had been with him for 6 years, a paint horse with intelligence enough to navigate treacherous terrain and speed to outrun most trouble that might arise on the frontier. More than that, the animal had been a connection to his people and their traditions of horsemanship that went back generations, a living symbol of the relationship between Lakota warriors and the creatures that had made their nomadic lifestyle possible. To see him reduced to a limping, pain-filled shadow of his former strength was like losing a brother. And Tokala's hands clenched into fists as he fought down the rage that threatened to overwhelm his judgment and compromise his ability to think clearly about their situation. "We can't stay here," Tokala realized, studying the carved bead that represented just one small piece of a much larger puzzle of threat and conspiracy. "They know where she is. They know we're protecting her, and they'll return with more men and better planning the next time they make an attempt." Walter Hutchins appeared at the clinic door like an answer to unspoken prayers, his battered hat in weathered hands and concern creasing his face as he took in the signs of violence and desperation that marked everyone present. The farmer was in his 40s, with the lean build and calloused hands of a man who'd worked hard for everything he possessed and understood the value of helping neighbors when trouble came calling. Because on the frontier, today's helper might be tomorrow's lifeline when circumstances reversed and assistance flowed in the opposite direction. "Heard about the trouble from 3 blocks away," Walter said simply, his words carrying the understated concern that frontier people use to express deep worry without appearing weak or emotional. "My mule team and wagon are outside if you folks need transport to somewhere safer than this town seems to be right now." Soon they were heading toward an abandoned cabin at Tallow Creek, their unlikely group crowded into Walter's sturdy vehicle. While Tokala and his sister Winona shared her paint horse despite his injuries and the pain that each movement sent through his wounded shoulder. The wagon's wooden wheels creaked and bounced over rutted tracks that hadn't seen maintenance since the territorial road crews had moved on to more profitable projects, while the morning sun climbed higher and cast longer shadows that might conceal pursuing enemies or watching eyes that reported their movements to hostile forces. Winona had ridden hard through the night to reach them, covering ground that would have challenged most riders, and arriving with 3 Lakota warriors whose presence had been enough to discourage immediate pursuit by enemies who understood that fighting Plains Indians on their own territory was a proposition that rarely ended well for overconfident white men. She was 5 years younger than Tokala, but possessed the same fierce protectiveness that had made their people legendary guardians of family and tribe, along with skills in tracking, hunting, and warfare that made her a valuable ally in any situation that might require such talents. The warriors who accompanied her, Yiska Seganam and Awoke, were men Tokala had known since childhood. Proven fighters who'd earned their reputations in conflicts with rival tribes and encroaching settlers who'd learned to respect Lakota territorial claims through bitter experience. Their presence served notice that any attack on Tokala or those under his protection would be met with the kind of response that had made their people feared and respected from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains. Throughout the journey toward uncertain safety, Conrad remained unusually quiet, his hand frequently moving to that locket in his pocket, with the persistence of a man worrying prayer beads or touching a talisman that brought both comfort and pain. Whenever Nellie spoke or laughed, small sounds of a child trying to find normalcy in a world that had suddenly filled with danger and violence. He would look at her with barely concealed anguish that grew more pronounced with each passing mile and each reminder of the innocence that his choices had helped to endanger. As they traveled through landscape that alternated between rolling grassland and rocky outcroppings that could conceal ambushes, Beatrice found herself riding beside Tokala when the trail allowed such arrangements. Their conversations ranged from practical matters like Nellie's care and their destination's defensibility to more personal topics that revealed depths of character and experience that made each more interesting to the other. She told him about her flight from Boston's suffocating society, where women were expected to be ornamental rather than useful, decorative rather than independent, and where marriage was treated as a business transaction that had little to do with affection, compatibility, or mutual respect. Her father had arranged her engagement to a man twice her age, who viewed her substantial dowry with more interest than he showed in her person. And she'd overheard enough conversations to understand that his gambling debts made her inheritance more attractive than any personal qualities she might possess. "Nor, why do you stay?" she asked during one quiet moment when they'd stopped to rest the animals and check their back trail for signs of pursuit. "You could live with your people away from all the suspicion and hostility that follows you in white settlements where your skills are valued, but your person is barely tolerated." Tokala was quiet for a long moment, watching Nellie play with prairie grass, while the adults discussed their route and considered the dangers that might lie ahead on unfamiliar trails that could lead to safety or into carefully prepared ambushes. Because children like her need protectors who understand both worlds, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience and hard-won wisdom. Someone who can move between Lakota and white communities, who knows the languages and customs of both peoples, and who can serve as a bridge when conflict threatens to destroy everything decent people are trying to build. He paused, touching the sacred feathers in his headband, as he often did when thinking of his lost sister and the responsibilities that her death had laid upon his shoulders. And because running away never solved anything permanent. Problems follow you wherever you go, unless you turn and face them, and some fights are worth having, even when the odds seem impossible. His words carried echoes of personal pain that Beatrice was beginning to understand had shaped his character in fundamental ways. The loss of his sister Ayanna had left him with a need to protect other children that went beyond simple duty or tribal obligation into something deeper and more personal. A drive to ensure that no other child died while he had strength to prevent it and skills to make a difference in dangerous situations. They were pursued before they'd traveled 10 miles along the winding trail that led through increasingly rough country toward the abandoned cabin that represented their best hope for defensible shelter. Rusty Joe rode at the head of a group that included Marcus Dietrich and several ranch hands, whose loyalty had been purchased with silver and maintained through fear, their horses raising dust clouds that could be seen for miles across the open grassland that offered few places to hide from determined pursuers. The chase led through rocky terrain where Tokala's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. His understanding of traditional Lakota travel routes and hunting paths, allowing him to guide their small convoy through passages that would slow their pursuers while avoiding open ground where superior numbers could be brought to bear effectively. His wounded shoulder screamed protest with every movement, but he forced himself to ignore the pain and focus on the tactical situation that required all his skills and experience to navigate successfully. At one point, when the riders drew close enough for rifle fire to become a real threat, Tokala dismounted despite his injuries and used his traditional bow to wound 2 attackers with arrows that struck without the telltale sound of gunfire that would have revealed their exact position to the remaining enemies. The sight of arrows rather than bullets seemed to unnerve their pursuers in ways that firearms wouldn't have, reminding them that they faced someone who understood warfare in methods their frontier experience hadn't prepared them to counter effectively. The silence of the bow, combined with the accuracy that came from years of practice, and the psychological impact of facing weapons that seemed to come from nowhere created confusion and hesitation among men who were accustomed to the straightforward brutality of gunfights and weren't prepared for the subtler tactics that Plains Indians had perfected over generations of conflict with enemies who outnumbered them but lacked their mobility and terrain knowledge. When Winona arrived with her war party, the presence of additional Lakota warriors was enough to convince their pursuers that discretion was the better part of valor, at least for the moment. The sight of painted faces and traditional weapons carried by men whose reputations for skill in combat were well known throughout the territory made it clear that any direct assault would be costly beyond what the situation seemed to warrant, especially when other options remained available for achieving their ultimate objectives. The abandoned cabin at Tallow Creek sat in a grove of cottonwood trees, whose leaves whispered secrets to the evening wind, surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that made the frontier's harshness seem almost worthwhile to those with eyes to appreciate such things. Built from weathered logs that had been chinked with clay and moss by trappers who'd moved on when the silver boom promised easier wealth, the structure had been home to men who'd understood the rhythms of the land and the patience required to survive in country that rewarded careful planning but punished carelessness with swift and permanent consequences. Inside the single large room, they worked to make the old structure as defensible as possible, while planning their next moves with the kind of careful deliberation that might mean the difference between survival and death in the challenges that lay ahead. Wooden shutters that had warped with age and weather were reinforced with additional planking, while furniture was arranged to provide cover and firing positions that would allow defenders to make the most effective use of their limited ammunition and superior knowledge of the interior layout. Winona took charge of teaching Nellie survival words in Lakota, simple commands and responses that could mean the difference between life and death if they were separated during an attack or forced to flee through territory where her brother's people might be their only source of assistance. The child proved remarkably quick to learn, despite her recent trauma, her young mind absorbing new concepts with the adaptability that had helped her survive the stagecoach attack, and might serve her well in whatever trials lay ahead. "Water is Imni," Winona said patiently, pointing to the cup in Nellie's small hands while emphasizing the correct pronunciation. "Food is Woyute. Say it back to me so I know you understand." "Manai," Nellie repeated carefully. Then, Woyute, her pronunciation making Winona smile with approval and encouragement. "Is good. Now when someone says hide, that's Nahma. You find the smallest, darkest place you can and stay there until someone you trust comes to get you. Never come out for strangers, no matter what they promise or threaten. Do you understand?" The child nodded solemnly, understanding that these weren't games, but lessons that might save her life. In circumstances too terrible for adults to explain fully, but too dangerous to ignore in their planning and preparation. "We need concrete evidence of this conspiracy," Conrad said, studying the deed with an intensity that seemed almost painful to watch, as if the legal document contained accusations that cut straight to his soul. Something more substantial than suspicions and coincidences that won't stand up in territorial court or convince federal marshals to take action against men with political connections. The freight yard ledger books, Deputy Will suggested with the logic of an experienced lawman who understood how paper trails could prove guilt more effectively than eyewitness testimony that could be challenged or discredited. If they survived the fire, they might contain payment records correspondence or other documentation that could prove connections between Dietrich and the people carrying out his orders. "I'll go back to town." Winona volunteered with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never been caught when she didn't want to be, whose skills in moving unseen through hostile territory had been honed by generations of ancestors who'd survived by avoiding detection when stealth was more valuable than confrontation. I can reach the ruins during the night hours, search for evidence while avoiding their watchers, and return before dawn with whatever can be found. As night fell across the prairie like a blanket of stars and shadow, Winona prepared for her dangerous reconnaissance mission with the methodical care of a warrior who understood that survival depended on preparation planning and the kind of attention to detail that left nothing to chance. She would have to evade Dietrich's watchers, who were certainly positioned around the town's search through the burned ruins of the freight yard for documents that might have survived the flames, and return with evidence that could make the difference between justice and continued persecution for everyone under her brother's protection. Conrad pulled Tokala aside as his sister made her final preparations, his weathered face haggard with the kind of exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from internal struggle that was tearing him apart, piece by piece. The sheriff's hands shook slightly as he reached for words that might explain the demons that were devouring his conscience and driving him toward a confession that could destroy what remained of his reputation and self-respect. "There's something you need to understand about the Patterson family," he began, then stopped as if the words were sticking in his throat like broken glass, painful to speak and dangerous to release into the world where they might do damage that couldn't be undone. About why this particular land is so critically important to certain powerful interests, and why some people are willing to kill to get their hands on those water rights. He glanced toward Nellie with an expression of such profound pain that it was difficult to witness his guilt-ridden features crumpling as he struggled with secrets that had been eating away at him like acid for weeks, corroding his ability to function as a lawman, and destroying his sense of himself as a decent human being worthy of respect or redemption. But before he could continue with whatever revelation was eating at his soul like a cancer, then they saw flames painting the distant horizon in shades of orange and red that spoke of destruction and retaliation. Walter's farm was burning in deliberate retaliation for his assistance, his hay barns and equipment sheds going up like torches in the night, while his livestock scattered in terror across pastures that had taken years to establish and maintain. "They're sending a message written in fire and destruction," Tokala realized with grim certainty, understanding that their enemies were escalating the conflict in ways designed to isolate them from potential allies and demonstrate the costs of opposing Dietrich's will. Conrad stared at the distant flames, with eyes that reflected more than just the light of burning buildings, his hand moving unconsciously to his pocket, in that gesture that was becoming as regular as breathing. Tom Dietrich doesn't make idle threats or issue empty warnings designed merely to intimidate. He'll keep escalating the violence, destroying everything and everyone that stands between him and what he wants, until he gets complete control over Tallow Creek and all the power that comes with it. The next afternoon brought Winona's return with evidence that would change everything they thought they understood about the forces arrayed against them and the scope of the conspiracy they were fighting. The smoke-blackened metal box she'd risked her life to retrieve from the freight yard's ruins contained documents that had survived the fire by hiding in places the flames couldn't reach, secreted away by someone who'd understood the value of keeping records and the danger of leaving evidence where enemies could find and destroy it. "I found this hidden beneath loose floorboards in what remained of the office," she said, offering the box to Beatrice, with hands that still trembled slightly from her night's work and the narrow escapes that had marked her journey through territory crawling with hostile watchers. It was concealed with the kind of care that suggests someone expected to return for it or wanted to make sure it would be found by the right people if something happened to prevent that return. But Conrad's face went completely white as bleached bone when he saw what else the box contained beyond the ledger books and correspondence they'd hoped to find. Nestled among the business documents was a second silver locket tarnished twin to the one in his pocket, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, and its contents representing connections that went deeper than professional relationships or casual acquaintance. No, he whispered with the desperation of a man trying to hold back an avalanche with his bare hands, his voice breaking as he recognized the implications of this discovery. Not that particular locket. Please, not that one. But Beatrice opened it, despite his protests, her fingers working the tiny catch with the patience of someone who understood that some secrets demanded to be revealed, regardless of the pain they might cause to those who tried to keep them buried. Inside was a lock of blonde hair that matched Nellie's exactly, and beneath it, a folded piece of paper covered with careful handwriting that would destroy lives with its revelations and strip away the last pretenses that had allowed Conrad to function despite his guilt. As she read Hugh Patterson's final message aloud, the terrible truth emerged like poison from an infected wound that had been festering beneath the surface for too long. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then my fears about my brother have proven correct beyond any doubt. Conrad has been compromised by Dietrich's money and threats, and I fear for our lives and our daughter's future. The deed to Tallow Creek is Nellie's only protection now. It is registered legally at the county office under case number 847B, witnessed by both Dietrich and Barnes, to ensure its validity cannot be questioned by anyone who might want to challenge it later. Conrad knows about the deed, which means Dietrich does too, and that knowledge puts all of us in mortal danger. If anything happens to us, trust only the teacher and the Lakota scout. They are the only ones in Willow Springs who cannot be bought with silver or intimidated with threats. Keep our daughter safe from the evil that men do when they value money more than family. Tell her that her Uncle Conrad was once a good man, before greed poisoned his heart and turned him against his own blood. Hugh. The cabin erupted into chaos as understanding dawned like sunrise over a battlefield, illuminating carnage that had been hidden by darkness and revealing the true scope of betrayal that had made orphans of innocent children and widows of loving wives who'd done nothing to deserve such fate. Your brother, Tokala, said, his voice deadly quiet, as he rose from his chair despite the protests from his wounded shoulder, his dark eyes blazing with a fury that had been building since he'd first suspected there was more to Conrad's behavior than simple law enforcement. Hugh Patterson was your own flesh and blood, and you sold him to his killers for silver. Conrad's carefully constructed composure collapsed entirely, like a dam bursting under impossible pressure, years of accumulated guilt pouring out in a torrent that swept away all pretense and deception, leaving him naked before the judgment of people who trusted him with their lives and the protection of an innocent child. Half-brother, he sobbed, pulling the matching locket from his pocket with shaking hands that could barely manage the simple task, the twin to the one Beatrice held, containing a photograph of the same blonde woman and a lock of dark hair that had once belonged to a child who'd called him Uncle Conrad, with the trust that family names were supposed to guarantee. The locket fell from his nerveless fingers to clatter on the wooden floor like an accusation given physical form, its metallic sound echoing in the sudden silence that followed his admission of guilt. Same father, different mothers. Hugh took our father's name when his mother remarried a Patterson from Missouri, who gave him opportunities in education that my mother couldn't provide after our father died, and left us with nothing but debts and disappointment. The confession spilled out in anguished gasps that spoke of months of suppressed guilt and self-loathing that had been eating away at him like cancer. How Tom Dietrich had approached him with a combination of threats and bribes that had seemed impossible to resist at the time. How the rancher had shown him photographs of what happened to sheriffs who didn't cooperate with his business interests, images of men found dead in their own jails with signs of torture that spoke of slow and creative methods of persuasion. How Conrad had believed he was arranging a simple robbery to scare Hugh into abandoning his land claim, not understanding Rusty Joe's reputation for leaving no witnesses alive to tell tales or identify the men who'd hired him. I arranged for them to hit the stagecoach. He whispered the words, coming out like broken glass that cut his throat and drew blood from wounds that would never fully heal. I gave Rusty Joe the route, the timing, everything he needed to make it look like a random robbery by drifters who'd moved on before anyone could organize pursuit. I killed my own brother for silver that turned to ashes the moment I learned his name and understood what I'd really done. Nellie had been listening with the incomprehending attention of childhood, but now she spoke in a small, clear voice that cut through the adult's shock like a blade forged from pure innocence. "You're the uncle Papa was scared of." "Yes, little one." Conrad whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks like rain on drought-stricken earth, each drop carrying the weight of crimes that could never be forgiven or forgotten. "I'm the uncle your papa was absolutely right to fear, and I deserve every bit of that fear, and more than you could ever understand." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, poisoning everything it touched with the knowledge of betrayal that went deeper than mere corruption. This was family destroying family for the promise of silver that would never wash the blood from guilty hands or restore the lives that had been sacrificed to one man's weakness and another's greed. Outside, the sound of approaching horses, more than 20 riders by the thundering of hoofbeats that shook the ground like an earthquake, signaled that their time for revelations and recriminations had run out like sand through an hourglass that had been measuring their lives in minutes rather than hours. Then they fled to the abandoned silver mine at Quicksilver Gulch, their only defensible position within reach of safety, before their enemies could organize a coordinated assault that would overwhelm their small group through sheer numbers and superior firepower. The mine entrance yawned before them, like a mouth leading into the earth's bowels, surrounded by the rotting remains of dreams that had died when the silver played out and left behind only darkness, abandonment, and the kind of desperate hope that drove men to seek shelter in places that might become tombs if their luck ran out, or their enemies proved more determined than expected. Inside the tunnels carved from living rock by men who'd believed fortune lay hidden in the mountain's heart, the temperature dropped noticeably, and their breathing echoed off stone walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of human ambition on a scale that made their current troubles seem like small chapters in a larger story of struggle between those who had power and those who needed protection from its abuse. Rust-stained tools and broken equipment littered the floors like the bones of long-dead hopes, remnants of dreams that had been abandoned when reality proved less generous than imagination had promised. "How deep do these tunnels extend into the mountain?" Dr. Edwin asked, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space, while his professional mind cataloged the defensive advantages and disadvantages of their chosen refuge. "Deep enough to hide us from immediate pursuit," Winona replied with the certainty of someone who'd explored every passage and memorized every turning that might offer escape or concealment. "But also deep enough to become our tomb if they manage to seal the entrance while we're inside and cut off our access to fresh air and freedom." Outside, Tom Dietrich's voice boomed across the gulch with the confidence of a man who held all the advantages and knew that time was working in his favor. "I know you can hear me in there. Send out the child and those documents that don't belong to you, and the rest of you can walk away from this situation with your lives and a chance to start over somewhere else." But they all knew it was a lie, as transparent as window glass, spoken by a man who understood that desperate people might grasp at any hope of survival, even when logic told them that promises from enemies were worth less than the breath used to speak them. Dietrich couldn't afford to leave witnesses alive, not with the evidence they carried and the knowledge they possessed about corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government and could bring down powerful men if it ever reached federal authorities who couldn't be bought or intimidated. His first attempt at negotiation was followed by a direct assault designed to test their defenses and determine how much resistance they could offer against superior numbers. 5 men rushed the entrance, while others provided covering fire from positions among the rocks, their boots ringing against stone as they charged toward what they expected to be easy targets, trapped like animals in a cave with no escape route. But Tokala's bow and Deputy Will's rifle drove them back with casualties that made it clear this wouldn't be the simple massacre Dietrich had probably expected. The silence of arrows, combined with the precision of aimed rifle fire, created a deadly crossfire that caught the attackers in the open ground before the entrance. Where courage and determination were no match for superior positioning, and the kind of tactical thinking that came from understanding how to make the most of limited resources against overwhelming odds. Next came an attempt to block the ventilation shaft, forcing several defenders to fight their way through narrow passages that barely allowed one person at a time, where the advantage of numbers was negated by the confined space and the defenders' superior knowledge of the tunnel layout. Walter proved surprisingly effective with his hunting rifle, while Dr. Edwin tended wounds with the grim efficiency of a man who'd learned battlefield medicine in circumstances where mistakes meant death and hesitation could be fatal for patients who depended on steady hands and quick thinking. When direct attacks failed to produce the quick victory Dietrich had expected, he resorted to tactics designed to break their will and force surrender through methods that inflicted suffering without requiring his men to face the deadly accurate fire that had already cost him several valuable fighters. He began shouting promises of mercy that alternated with detailed descriptions of what would happen to Nellie if she weren't surrendered immediately. His words designed to sow fear and despair among defenders who might be willing to sacrifice themselves but couldn't bear the thought of an innocent child paying the price for their resistance. Through it all, Conrad sat bound, but increasingly tormented by the weight of his betrayal and the sounds of violence that his choices had made inevitable. Each threat against his niece drove the knife of guilt deeper into his conscience, while the faces of his dead brother and sister-in-law seemed to materialize in the smoky air, to remind him of the price that innocence had already paid for his weakness and corruption. Finally, Dietrich's patience ran out like water through a broken vessel, and he decided to end the siege through methods that would drive his enemies into the open, where superior numbers could be brought to bear with devastating effect. The assault began with smoke-thick choking clouds pumped into the tunnel entrance by fires of wet brush and green wood that had been specifically chosen for their ability to produce the most toxic fumes possible, turning the simple act of breathing into conscious torture that would eventually force even the most determined defenders to choose between suffocation and surrender. Within minutes of the smoke's introduction, the acrid haze burned their eyes like acid and seared their throats with each desperate breath, turning the air itself into an enemy that couldn't be fought with weapons or defeated through courage alone. The caustic fumes carried the smell of burning vegetation mixed with chemicals that spoke of deliberate preparation designed to maximize suffering and hasten the moment when their victims would be forced to emerge from their shelter and face whatever waited for them in the world above. Nellie was the first to suffer serious effects from the poisonous air, her small body racked by violent coughing spasms as the toxic atmosphere invaded her delicate lungs and began doing permanent damage to tissues that weren't designed to handle such punishment. Blood flecked her lips within minutes, a terrifying sign that the smoke was causing serious internal injury that could prove fatal even if they managed to escape their current predicament and find medical treatment for the chemical burns that were scarring her throat and airways. But we have to get her out of here before this kills her, Beatrice said with desperation that made her voice crack and break, holding the child against her chest as if her own body could somehow filter the poisonous air and protect innocent lungs from the deliberate cruelty of men who would use a child suffering as a weapon to achieve their goals. The old ventilation shaft about 50 yards deeper in the mine. Winona pointed toward a narrow opening that was barely visible in the gloom and smoke that filled the tunnels like fog from hell itself. But it's a dangerous climb, even for healthy adults who aren't weakened by injuries and smoke inhalation, and she's just a child whose strength is already compromised by what she's been through. Conrad looked up from where he'd been studying the mine's layout with the desperate attention of a man seeking redemption, redemption through sacrifice that might balance the scales of justice and provide some small measure of atonement for sins that could never be fully forgiven or forgotten. There's another way to handle this situation, though it requires someone to make the ultimate sacrifice for the good of the others. His voice carried a determination that hadn't been there since his confession had stripped away his pretenses and forced him to confront the reality of what his choices had cost innocent people who trusted him to protect them rather than betray them to their enemies. The old powder magazine in the deepest tunnel, if there are still blasting charges stored there after all these years of abandonment, we could collapse part of the entrance tunnel and create enough confusion and debris to cover an escape, while some of you slip out through the ventilation shaft under cover of the chaos. Someone would have to stay behind to light the fuse and trigger the explosion. Tokala realized with the grim logic of a warrior who understood that victory often required sacrifice, and that some battles could only be won by those willing to pay the ultimate price for the safety of others. And that person wouldn't survive the blast in these confined spaces where the force would be amplified beyond anything the human body could endure. "I'll do it," Conrad said quietly, his voice carrying a resolve that seemed to come from some deep well of strength that guilt and self-loathing hadn't been able to poison completely. "This is all my fault, every bit of suffering, every drop of blood that's been spilled, every tear that child has shed, because of the choices I made when I was too weak to stand up to threats and too greedy to refuse bribes that came with the blood of innocence." The smoke was thickening with each passing minute, turning the air into a barely breathable soup that left them all gasping and wheezing like drowning victims fighting for each breath that might be their last. Nellie's coughing had progressed beyond simple irritation to the desperate wheezing gasps that spoke of airways closing and lungs filling with fluid that threatened to drown her from within. Blood ran freely from her mouth now as the caustic fumes ravaged her throat and delicate lung tissues with chemical burns that would leave permanent scars if she survived long enough to heal. "Please," she whispered between coughing fits that racked her small frame with convulsions of pain, looking at Tokala with eyes that held all the terror and innocence of childhood facing incomprehensible cruelty. "Don't let me die here in the dark like this. I don't want to die without seeing the sky again." The words cut through everyone's heart like a blade forged from pure anguish, stripping away all pretense and reducing the situation to its essential elements. Innocent life threatened by adult greed and corruption, with time running out like sand through fingers that couldn't hold back the inevitable, unless someone acted with courage and decisiveness that might cost everything, but could save what mattered most. We do this now before she suffers any more damage that might be permanent. Tokala decided with the authority of a war chief, making final battle plans when defeat meant death for everyone under his protection. "Conrad, find your powder and rig your charges with whatever time you think you'll need. Everyone else prepare to move fast when the explosion comes, because we won't get a second chance if this doesn't work." Dietrich's men were advancing into the tunnel now with the confidence of hunters who'd cornered their prey and were closing in for the kill, their torches visible through the smoke like evil stars in a poisoned sky that promised no mercy for the weak or innocent. The sound of their boots on stone grew louder with each passing moment, accompanied by the scrape of rifle barrels against tunnel walls and the low murmur of men coordinating for a final assault that would leave no survivors to tell tales or seek revenge for what was about to happen in the darkness beneath the mountain. Conrad disappeared into the mine's depths, with his hands still bound, but his purpose clear. Making his way through passages he'd memorized during their earlier exploration, while the others prepared for what might be their final battle on Earth. Nellie continued coughing up blood that stained Beatrice's dress in spreading patches of crimson, her small body growing weaker with each labored breath that brought more poison into lungs already damaged beyond what any child should have to endure. "Found it." Conrad's voice echoed from deep within the tunnels, carrying both triumph and resignation in equal measure, as he located the powder magazine that might hold their salvation or their doom. Enough black powder to bring down half this mountain and wake every corpse in 3 territories. That's when Dietrich's men reached their defensive position like demons, emerging from the deepest circles of hell, or their faces blackened with soot, and their eyes bright with the bloodlust that came from knowing that victory was within their grasp, and that no power on earth could prevent them from claiming their prize. Rusty Joe appeared through the smoke, with his red beard singed by flames, and his eyes blazing with the kind of anticipation that marked men who'd found their calling in violence and destruction, grinning with the satisfaction of a predator that had finally cornered wounded prey after a long and frustrating hunt. Behind him came Marcus Dietrich, with the arrogance of youth that had never faced real consequences for its actions, and 3 ranch hands, whose faces were grim with the knowledge that they were here to commit murder rather than simple robbery, their consciences already deadened by previous crimes that had prepared them for whatever atrocities their employer might require. "Well, well, well," Joe said with satisfaction that made his voice carry clearly through the toxic air, his words dripping with malice and anticipation. "Look what we have here, the whole nest of troublemakers all gathered together and waiting to be exterminated like the vermin they've proven themselves to be." He raised his rifle toward Nellie, who was barely conscious from blood loss and smoke inhalation that had left her weak as a newborn kitten, with the casual cruelty of a man who'd killed children before, and felt nothing but convenience in removing obstacles that stood between him and his employer's goals. That's when the mine exploded with the fury of a god's wrath unleashed upon the earth. The blast wave knocked everyone to their knees as debris rained from the ceiling in a deadly hail that could crush skulls like eggshells and break bones like dry kindling, while the sound itself was so overwhelming that it seemed to come from inside their heads rather than from any external source. Support timbers that had stood for decades cracked and groaned under sudden stress that exceeded their engineering limits by factors that no human calculation had ever considered, while dust filled the air so thickly that visibility dropped to mere inches and breathing became a conscious struggle against suffocation. In the chaos that followed, with the mountain shaking around them like a living thing in its death throes, Tokala launched himself at Rusty Joe with the desperate fury of a man fighting for more than his own life, tackling the outlaw. As gunfire erupted throughout the chamber in a deadly symphony of violence and confusion that turned the confined space into a battlefield, where death could come from any direction at any moment. This wasn't the brief scuffle that might settle a saloon disagreement, but brutal personal combat between men who understood that only one would walk away alive from this encounter that had been building toward violence since their first meeting in Abilene. Joe was bigger and stronger, with the kind of raw physical power that came from years of hard living and harder fighting. But Tokala had speed skill, and the kind of focused rage that came from protecting innocence against men who would destroy it for profit. They rolled across the rocky floor in a tangle of arms and legs, throwing punches that carried the force of sledgehammers and grappling for weapons, while bullets whined around them like angry wasps, and the sound of falling rock added percussion to the symphony of destruction that was bringing down centuries of geological stability in a matter of minutes. Joe managed to get his hands around Tokala's throat, squeezing with the strength of fingers that had strangled men before his thumbs finding the pressure points that would cut off blood flow to the brain and bring unconsciousness, followed quickly by death. Black spots danced at the edges of Tokala's vision as oxygen became a precious commodity that his body craved more than water in a desert. But he remembered Ayanna's face as she died in his arms 7 winters ago, and Nellie's trust as she'd looked to him for protection and found strength he didn't know he still possessed despite his injuries and the poison in his lungs. His hand found a sharp piece of debris that had been knocked loose by the explosion, and he drove it into Joe's ribs with force born of desperation and righteous fury. The outlaw's grip loosened as pain and surprise coursed through his body, giving Tokala the opening he needed to break free and reach for his knife. The traditional Lakota blade that had been his grandfather's and carried prayers for justice along with its sharp edge. But before he could complete the movement that would end their struggle permanently, a section of the ceiling chose that moment to collapse near their position, sending a cascade of rocks that buried Tokala's legs and pinned him to the floor with crushing weight that sent waves of agony through his body and threatened to drag him into merciful unconsciousness. Every attempt to free himself sent fresh lightning through his trapped limbs as tons of stone pressed down with geological patience that made human struggles seem insignificant. But he could see Nellie's pale face through the smoke and dust, and that vision gave him strength to continue fighting, even when his body screamed for surrender to pain and exhaustion that promised peace if he would only stop struggling against the inevitable. Rusty Joe, wounded by the debris but still dangerous as a cornered wolf with nothing left to lose, raised his pistol for a killing shot that would end this fight permanently and eliminate the last obstacle between him and the completion of his contract with Tom Dietrich. His finger tightened on the trigger with the slow deliberation of a man who wanted to savor his revenge against someone who'd cost him money and pride. In equal measure, his grin widening as he anticipated the moment when his bullet would punch through flesh and bone to find the heart that had been beating with such stubborn defiance. That's when Sheriff Conrad appeared through the smoke and debris like a ghost seeking redemption for sins that had consumed his soul. His Colt .45, steady in his hands, despite the blood streaming from his face, where falling rocks had opened his scalp to the bone and sent crimson rivers down his cheeks like tears of guilt made visible. His eyes were clear with purpose for the first time in months, the kind of clarity that came to men who'd finally chosen which side of the moral line they belonged on, and were prepared to pay whatever price that choice demanded. "Hello, Joe," Conrad said with deadly calm that cut through the chaos like a blade through silk, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd rediscovered his badge's true meaning after months of treating it as nothing more than a license for corruption. "Surprised to see me still breathing after you and your friends tried so hard to arrange my burial." His bullet took Rusty Joe center mass with the precision of someone who'd spent years practicing with firearms and understood exactly where to place a shot for maximum effect, spinning the outlaw around and dropping him to the rocky floor, where he lay twitching in the spreading pool of his own blood, while his life leaked away through holes that no amount of pressure could seal. Tom Dietrich emerged from the smoke with his rifle raised and his face a mask of fury at seeing his carefully laid plans dissolving into chaos and bloodshed that threatened to expose years of careful preparation to federal authorities, who wouldn't be as easily bought or intimidated as local officials had proven to be. "You're supposed to be dead. Conrad buried under a ton of rock where you can't cause any more problems for decent business arrangements. Disappointed by my continued existence. Don't worry about it too much. I probably will be dead soon enough considering the shape this place is in and the amount of blood I'm losing." Conrad's voice carried grim humor that spoke of a man who'd made peace with his fate and found freedom in no longer caring about his own survival. "But I wanted to make sure you knew that federal marshals are already on their way to your ranch with arrest warrants and enough evidence to hang you 3 times over for the crimes you've committed in pursuit of power and wealth." "You're lying through your teeth, Conrad. You've got no way to send messages from inside this tomb, and everyone who might have carried word for you is either dead or about to be." "Am I lying?" Your boy Marcus there can tell you about the evidence we sent ahead with fast riders before we ever came to this place." Conrad gestured toward the young man, who was bleeding from one of Tokala's arrows, embedded deep in his leg, and looking far less arrogant than he had minutes earlier when victory had seemed certain and resistance had appeared futile. For a moment that stretched like eternity while the mountain continued its slow collapse around them, and the tableau held 3 men, with guns drawn in a mine that was slowly falling apart, each waiting for someone else to make the first move that would determine who lived and who died in the darkness beneath tons of rock and earth, that cared nothing for human ambitions or the price of justice, in a land where might usually made right. The air was thick with dust and smoke that made breathing a conscious effort requiring determination just to draw each breath, while overhead more support timbers groaned under stress that threatened total structural failure and burial for everyone still alive, in the tunnels that had become a tomb for some, and might yet claim them all before this confrontation reached its inevitable conclusion. Then Marcus Dietrich, driven by panic, and the kind of inexperience that made young men do fatally stupid things when desperation clouded their judgment, fired wildly at Conrad, with a shot that went wide and struck sparks off the tunnel wall, illuminating the scene for a brief moment in light that revealed the full horror of their situation and the impossibility of escape for anyone who remained below ground much longer. The sheriff's return shot was measured and precise despite his wounds and the chaos surrounding them, catching the boy in the chest with a bullet that spun him around like a dancer performing some macabre waltz before dropping him to the stone floor, where he lay gasping out his life in a spreading pool that mixed his blood with the dust and debris of his father's collapsed ambitions. Tom Dietrich's rifle boomed in response, the sound echoing off stone walls like thunder trapped in a bottle. And Conrad went down hard with multiple wounds that no frontier medicine could possibly treat successfully. His weapon flew from nerveless fingers as he struck the rocky floor with bone-jarring impact that drove the last reserves of strength from his battered body. But the gunshots had destabilized the already weakened tunnel structure beyond any hope of recovery, pushing the delicate balance of forces past the point where human engineering could maintain the illusion of safety, in a place where nature had never intended people to burrow so deep into the Earth's bones. With a grinding roar that seemed to come from the planet's very core, the entire section began collapsing in earnest tons of rock and timber, falling with the inexorable weight of geological forces that no human power could resist or deflect. Through sheer desperation that gave him strength beyond normal human limits, Tokala managed to free his crushed legs from the debris that had pinned him and began crawling toward the ventilation shaft opening with movements that sent waves of agony through his body, but carried him closer to the possibility of survival with each agonizing inch of progress. Every movement was torture that threatened to drag him into unconsciousness. But Nellie's pale face drove him forward like a vision of everything worth fighting for in a world that seemed determined to crush hope beneath the weight of adult cruelty and corruption. Tom Dietrich and his remaining men were buried under tons of stone and earth. In a matter of seconds, their screams cut short by the mountain's inexorable weight, as justice finally claimed those who'd thought their wealth and power made them immune to consequences for their actions. The tunnel filled with dust so thick it was like breathing ground glass, while the sound of falling rock continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, as centuries of geological stability collapsed into chaos that would seal these passages forever. "Tokala!" Winona's voice echoed down the narrow ventilation passage like salvation calling from heaven itself, her words carrying hope and urgency in equal measure. "Grab the rope, we're pulling you up." Strong hands belonging to his sister and the Lakota warriors, who'd remained loyal despite the dangers, hauled him up through the shaft toward daylight and freedom. Each foot of progress marked by pain that would have broken a weaker man, but brought him closer to the clean air and open sky that represented life itself after the poisonous atmosphere of the collapsing mine. At the top of the shaft, he found Nellie unconscious in Beatrice's arms, her breathing shallow and labored, but steady enough to suggest she might survive this ordeal if they could get her proper medical treatment for the smoke damage that had scarred her throat and lungs. Her face was pale as winter snow, but there was life in the rise and fall of her chest, and that was more hope than any of them had dared expect during the darkest moments of their underground battle. Dr. Edwin was already working to clear blood and debris from her throat and airways, with the skilled hands of a physician who dealt with smoke inhalation before, and understood the delicate balance between aggressive treatment and further injury to tissues that had already been damaged beyond what any child should have to endure. "She'll live," he said, though his expression was grave with professional concern that spoke of long-term consequences that would follow her for years to come. "The smoke damage was severe, and she'll have breathing problems for months, maybe years, depending on how well she heals. But she's young and strong, and that counts for something when fighting injuries like these." Conrad had also been pulled from the collapsing mine, but just barely alive and broken by falling rocks that had crushed bones and opened wounds that no frontier medicine could possibly treat with any hope of success. He lay propped against a boulder in the afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness below, blood soaking through his shirt from multiple injuries that were slowly draining away what remained of his life, while he struggled to use his final moments for something more meaningful than simply dying. "Tell Nellie," he whispered to Tokala with his dying breath, using the last of his strength to deliver a message that mattered more than his own life or the pain that was consuming his body like fire. "Tell her that Uncle Conrad remembered how to be a good man when it mattered most, even though it took him too long to find that courage. Tell her I'm sorry about her parents, and that I hope someday she can forgive a foolish old man who let greed poison his heart against his own family." Then Conrad's eyes closed forever, with something approaching peace on his battered features, and the mountain's rumble finally fell silent, leaving only the wind across the ridge and the distant cry of hawks circling in the clean air above the destruction that had claimed the lives of evil men while sparing those who'd fought for justice and the protection of innocence. The morning sun painted the grasslands gold as Marshal Henry Wade's federal posse worked methodically to clear what remained of the mine entrance, their efforts hampered by the sheer volume of rock that had fallen when the powder charges destabilized the entire tunnel system and brought down sections of mountain that had stood since the world was young. Bodies were recovered one by one from the debris Tom Dietrich crushed beyond recognition, by tons of stone that had erased his features and left only the expensive boots and belt buckle that marked him as a man of wealth and power, who discovered too late that money couldn't buy immunity from the consequences of evil choices. His son Marcus was found nearby with Tokala's arrow still embedded in his leg and Conrad's bullet through his heart, while Rusty Joe lay in a pool of his own blood with the sheriff's final shot, having ended a career of violence that had terrorized 3 territories. Finally, they recovered Sheriff Conrad himself, whose final sacrifice had saved them all from a conspiracy that reached far beyond Willow Springs into the highest levels of territorial government and involved politicians whose names would shock the public when the trials began in federal court, where local corruption couldn't influence the proceedings. The 2 survivors among Dietrich's men were singing like canaries in springtime when they realized that cooperation with federal authorities offered their only hope of avoiding the hangman's rope, providing detailed evidence of corruption that reached all the way to the territorial capital and involved land offices, mining claims, railroad right-of-ways, and banking arrangements that had been systematically manipulated to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few ruthless individuals who'd believed themselves above the law. The conspiracy's scope was larger and more complex than anyone had imagined, with tentacles reaching into every aspect of territorial governance and economic development, affecting everything from water rights and grazing permits to the placement of roads and the location of new settlements that might challenge established power structures. Federal prosecutors would spend months unraveling the full extent of the corruption and bringing charges against everyone who'd participated in the systematic theft of public resources for private gain. Tokala sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the recovery operation, his legs still weak from their crushing but functional enough to carry him with only a slight limp that would become more pronounced in cold weather and serve as a permanent reminder of the price he'd paid for protecting innocence against those who would destroy it for profit. Dr. Edwin had warned that he'd walk with these reminders for the rest of his life. But they were prices he was willing to pay for the knowledge that Nellie was safe, and that justice had finally been served to those who'd thought their wealth made them untouchable. "What happens to Nellie now?" he asked Marshal Wade, who was documenting evidence with the thoroughness of a federal lawman, who understood that details would matter when cases reached court and that sloppy paperwork could allow guilty men to escape punishment on technical grounds. "Miss Thompson has petitioned for permanent guardianship with your endorsement as a character witness and protector," Wade replied, making careful notes in his official record book that would become part of the legal foundation for Nellie's future security. "The territorial court has already approved it unanimously, first time I've seen them agree on anything that quickly, which probably says something about how clear-cut this case appeared to everyone involved." Below them, Beatrice was teaching Nellie how to braid grass stems while they waited for the final legal proceedings to conclude their quiet conversation, punctuated by laughter that sounded like music after all the violence and death they'd witnessed in recent days. The child's voice was still hoarse from smoke damage that would take months to fully heal. But she was laughing a sound as precious as spring water after a long drought in desert country, where hope was often the only thing that kept people alive through the hardest times. The territorial agreement negotiations proceeded more smoothly than anyone had dared hope, helped significantly by evidence that Tom Dietrich's corruption had reached into the highest levels of territorial government and created a political climate where fair dealing with Native American tribes looked like good policy rather than dangerous precedent that might encourage other groups to demand similar treatment. A preliminary agreement was reached within days, establishing immediate protections for Lakota water access at traditional crossing points, while recognizing Nellie's legal ownership of her father's land. A compromise that served everyone's immediate interests while laying the groundwork for more comprehensive negotiations that would take months or years to complete through proper legal channels. The local memorandum of understanding carried the weight of federal backing, making it enforceable in ways that previous agreements had never been. But everyone understood that converting these provisions into permanent territorial law would require extensive legal processes and political negotiations at levels far above local authority. Walter's farm was rebuilt with territorial emergency funds that compensated him not only for his losses, but provided resources for improvements that made his operation more efficient and profitable than it had been before the attack. Dr. Edwin returned to his medical practice with stories that would entertain patients for years to come, and a reputation for courage under fire that brought him respect throughout the territory. Deputy Will grew into his new responsibilities as sheriff with careful attention to legal procedure and professional ethics that had been notably missing during Conrad's compromised tenure, bringing a level of integrity to law enforcement that Willow Springs had never previously enjoyed. 2 weeks after the mine collapse, the abandoned cabin at Tallow Creek had been transformed into something approaching a real home through the combined efforts of people who'd become family through shared danger, mutual protection, and the kind of bonds forged in the crucible of life-threatening crisis that couldn't be broken by time or distance. Walter contributed lumber and hardware from his rebuilt farm, while Winona's husband and brother-in-law provided traditional Lakota construction techniques that turned rough timber into solid walls and a proper roof that would keep out winter weather and prairie storms that could destroy inadequate shelter in minutes. The result was a structure that combined the best of both cultures' building methods, creating something stronger and more practical than either tradition could have achieved alone. Beatrice established a small but thriving school in the main room where Nellie studied alongside 3 Lakota children whose families had accepted Winona's invitation to join the growing settlement that was becoming a model for cooperation between peoples who traditionally viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. The sound of laughter and recitation filled the cabin during morning lessons, creating the kind of domestic peace that had seemed impossible during those desperate days when their lives hung by threads as thin as spider silk, and their future depended on courage, luck, and the willingness of good people to risk everything for the protection of innocence. During quiet evenings when the day's work was done and the children were settled for the night, Tokala and Beatrice found themselves sharing stories and dreams that revealed depths of character and experience that made each more interesting and attractive to the other with every passing day. She told him about her escape from Boston's suffocating expectations, where women were valued more for their appearance and connections than for their intelligence or abilities, while he shared the burden of living between 2 worlds that often seemed incompatible, but somehow found common ground in shared values and mutual respect. Their growing closeness wasn't the rushed romance of popular novels, but something deeper and more substantial: mutual respect and understanding forged in crisis, seasoned by shared values and common purpose, and strengthened by the daily work of building something meaningful from the ruins of what others had tried to destroy. When Beatrice took his hand, while they watched Nellie play by the creek, it felt as natural as sunrise after a long night of storm and uncertainty, a gesture that promised partnership rather than possession and commitment that went beyond simple attraction to encompass shared responsibility for the future they were building together. Tokala's injuries healed well enough for light work, though Dr. Edwin's warnings about permanent limitations proved accurate with the passage of time that couldn't undo damage to muscles, bones, and joints that had been pushed beyond their limits during the fight for survival. He could draw his traditional bow again and hunt small game for the family table, but not with the power and precision he'd once taken for granted, a permanent reminder that heroism carried lasting costs that couldn't be erased by gratitude or good intentions. The pain in his knee worsened with cold weather and changes in atmospheric pressure, while his shoulder would never regain the full strength and flexibility that had made him one of the most skilled scouts in the territory. On a warm September afternoon, when the cottonwoods were beginning to show their autumn colors and the air carried the crisp promise of changing seasons, Nellie made an announcement that surprised everyone with its simple profundity and perfect symbolism for their situation and hopes for the future. "I want to plant a tree right here by the creek," she said with the serious determination that marked all her important decisions and reflected the kind of careful thinking that had helped her survive experiences that would have broken many adults. "Right where everyone can see it when they come to visit us and remember what we built together." "What kind of tree would you like to plant?" Beatrice asked with genuine curiosity about the child's reasoning, knowing that Nellie rarely made requests without careful consideration of their implications and consequences. "A willow tree," she replied without hesitation, her choice reflecting wisdom beyond her years and an understanding of symbolism that would have impressed scholars and philosophers. "Winona told me they grow fast, and their roots go deep to find water, even when the creek runs low during dry years that test everything that lives along its banks. She says they bend in strong winds instead of breaking like other trees might. And they live for a very long time if you take good care of them and give them what they need to flourish." It was such a perfectly practical and symbolic choice that the adults exchanged meaningful looks that spoke of understanding deeper than words could express. Here was a child who'd lost everything to adult greed and violence, choosing to plant something that would grow and endure long after the immediate crisis had faded from memory. Something that would bend without breaking when storms came. Find sustenance, even in difficult times when resources were scarce, and provide shelter and beauty for future generations who might never know the names of those who'd planted it, but would benefit from their wisdom and foresight. They planted the willow sapling the next morning in a small ceremony that included everyone who'd become part of their extended family, through shared trials and mutual support, with Nellie doing most of the digging, while adults offered encouragement and advice about proper depth root placement and the kind of care that would help young trees establish themselves in new ground. When the sapling was firmly established in the creek bank soil, with its roots reaching toward water that would sustain it through seasons of plenty and times of drought, she stepped back and studied her work with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished something important and meaningful that would outlast her own lifetime. Now it's really home, she declared with the absolute certainty that only children possessed when they'd found their place in the world and understood that they were safe among people who cared for them and would protect them from whatever dangers might threaten their future happiness and security. Looking around at the faces of people who'd become family through shared danger, mutual protection, and the kind of bonds forged in the crucible of life-threatening crisis, Takala had to agree completely with her assessment. This unlikely collection of individuals, a Lakota warrior with permanent reminders of his sacrifice. A frontier schoolteacher who'd found her calling in protecting the innocent and building bridges between cultures, an orphan child whose spirit had survived everything evil men could devise to break it, and their extended network of allies who'd chosen justice over profit and courage over safety, had created something genuinely worth defending with their lives and worth building upon for future generations. The willow would grow tall and strong, its roots reaching deep into the fertile earth, while its flexible branches stretched toward the endless sky above the prairie that had witnessed so much suffering and cruelty, but had also seen the triumph of love over hatred, justice over corruption, and hope over despair. Like the fragile but determined peace they'd built along Tallow Creek through blood and sacrifice, it would require constant care and attention to flourish in the harsh conditions of frontier life, where survival was never guaranteed and comfort was always temporary. But it would endure through drought and storm, through seasons of abundance and times of scarcity, providing shade for weary travelers and beauty for those wise enough to appreciate the simple miracle of growth and renewal. In a land where such things were precious beyond any treasure that could be measured in gold or silver. As sunset painted the prairie in brilliant shades of gold and crimson that made the grasslands look like a vast canvas created by an artist with unlimited imagination and perfect understanding of beauty's true nature, Takala stood with Beatrice and Nellie beside their newly planted tree, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky like distant beacons of hope and promise for the future they would build together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficulties. It always did on the frontier, where survival required constant vigilance and adaptation to circumstances that could change as quickly as prairie weather. But tonight, they were home in the truest sense of the word, safe, among people who cared for them and committed to their welfare together as a family bound by something stronger than blood or law, or the accident of birth that had brought them into the same world. It was enough to build a life on. It was everything that mattered in the end.